A foreign widow with nothing, no land, no inheritance, no bloodline in Israel, became the great-grandmother of the wealthiest dynasty in all of biblical history. That is not an accident. That is a blueprint. And by the time this teaching reaches its final revelation, you will understand exactly why her name, Ruth, stands inside the genealogy of King David and King Solomon, not despite her poverty, but because of what she did inside it. Now, listen carefully, because the real shock is not that a foreigner entered the lineage of Israel's greatest kings. The real shock is that she started below zero, in a land of collapse, in a season of death, carrying nothing but a choice. Moab was not simply a foreign country. In the ancient world, Moab represented everything Israel was told to guard against. A nation born from moral failure, spiritually bankrupt, economically shallow, cut off from covenant promise. When Naomi's husband Elimelech chose to relocate his family there, it was a decision made from fear and scarcity rather than faith. He left the land of provision to survive in a land of substitutes, and substitutes always expire before you expect them to. Elimelech died in Moab. Both sons died in Moab. What remained was 3 widows, no male protector, no property, and no legal standing. In the ancient Near Eastern economic system, that was not just poverty. That was effective erasure. Most people read this as a tragedy waiting for a rescue, but the Lord was already positioning something no human strategist could have drafted. And at the end of this teaching, there is a revelation about Ruth's descendants that will permanently change how you understand the relationship between righteousness and generational wealth. Stay until the end. You cannot afford to miss it. Here is what no one tells you about Ruth, chapter 1, verse 16 and verse 17. The moment Ruth spoke those words, "Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die," she was not making a sentimental declaration. She was making an economic decision with permanent consequences. She was choosing relational capital over immediate comfort. And in the ancient world, that distinction was not poetic. It was survival strategy written in the language of covenant. Think about what she was walking away from. She was a Moabite woman with family ties to royalty. She had cultural fluency there. She had options there. Not abundant options, but options. Orpah, her sister-in-law, calculated the situation correctly by the world's logic and turned back. Nobody blames Orpah in the text. The road back was reasonable. But reasonable roads rarely lead to remarkable destinations. Ruth chose instead to attach herself to an old woman with nothing in a land that viewed Moabites with deep legal suspicion, heading into a city where her ethnicity alone could close every door. She was not chasing a dream. She was honoring a bond, and that distinction, honoring a bond over chasing an outcome, is the first principle of relational capital that the world of finance will never print in a textbook. Now here is where most people miss the move entirely. When Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem, Ruth did not wait for an invitation. She went immediately into the fields to glean. Gleaning was the lowest rung on the ancient Israelite economic ladder. It was work legally reserved for the poor, the widow, and the foreigner, explicitly protected under the law in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9 and verse 10. It required walking behind the professional harvesters, bending low, picking up what others had already passed over. There was no title in gleaning. There was no salary negotiation. There was no prestige. It was entry-level labor in a system designed for the destitute. And she did it without complaint. First day in Israel, no orientation period, no strategy meeting. She simply identified the available opportunity and moved toward it while the morning was still cool. Stop. Because this is precisely the move that most people refuse to make. They wait for a role that matches their self-image instead of entering at the level the door is actually open. Ruth had royal blood. She gleaned anyway. But then watch what happens when diligence meets divine positioning. Ruth, chapter 2, verse 3, states she happened to glean in the portion of the field belonging to Boaz. The Hebrew word there carries the scent of divine orchestration dressed in the clothing of coincidence. She did not know whose field it was. She simply went where the opportunity existed, and the Lord steered her steps with precision while she was busy working. This is the architecture of ancient provision. You move first, you move humbly, and the coordinates are set without your knowledge. Where in the world are you watching this teaching from right now? Drop your city in the comments, because people discovering these ancient financial principles are waking up all over the globe, and we want to know where you are. King Solomon spent decades observing the patterns that separate the prosperous from the perpetually struggling, and he did not conclude that the difference was talent. He concluded it was diligence, a specific, disciplined, non-negotiable daily output that compounds quietly until the gap becomes impossible to ignore. Proverbs chapter 10 verse 4 declares that lazy hands create poverty, but the hands of the diligent bring wealth. That is not a metaphor. In an agrarian economy, the person who arrived at the field first, stayed the longest, and returned the next morning consistently was the person who accumulated. Ruth was that person. The text in Ruth chapter 2 verse 7 records that she arrived at the field early in the morning and had not stopped working except for a brief rest in the shelter. The overseer of Boaz noticed before Boaz even arrived. Diligence attracts witnesses before it attracts rewards. Now here is the principle hiding beneath that surface detail. Boaz did not notice Ruth because she was dramatic or loud or self-promoting. He noticed her because the infrastructure of his own operation told him about her before she said a word. The harvesters reported her character. The overseer described her consistency. Her reputation preceded her arrival to the conversation. That is how excellence works in every era. It does not knock on doors. It builds a file that others carry on its behalf. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 24 confirms it. The hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor. Excellence always attracts high-capacity benefactors eventually because people of means are perpetually searching for people of consistency. They have capital. They need character to steward it alongside them. Boaz was a man of significant standing in Bethlehem. The Hebrew term used for him, Gibor Hayil, means a man of great valor and substantial resources, a wealthy, influential landowner. When he looked at Ruth gleaning in his field and asked the overseer about her, what followed was not charity. What followed was a business recognition. He saw someone with the attributes he valued most: loyalty, diligence, courage, covenant faithfulness. And he began to structurally realign the economics of his field to ensure she prospered. He told his workers to deliberately leave additional grain behind for her. He invited her to eat at his table. He warned the young men not to touch her. He was not simply being generous. He was extending the protection of his name over her operations. And in the ancient economy, the name of a powerful man was the most durable asset a vulnerable person could carry. This brings us to the architecture of the kinsman-redeemer law, the goal principle embedded in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 25. The law stated that when a family member fell into poverty, lost property, or was left without a male heir, the nearest relative with the means and willingness to do so was legally authorized and morally expected to step in, not to give charity, to restore equity, to transfer asset ownership back into the family line so that the covenant promise of inheritance could continue. This was not sentiment. This was ancient asset protection written into the legal code of an entire nation. It meant that poverty, in God's design for Israel, was never intended to be permanent. There was always a legal mechanism for restoration embedded into the community structure, a built-in circuit breaker against generational destitution. If this wisdom is resonating in your spirit right now, go ahead and press the like button, because you are not watching this by accident. The night Ruth walked onto the threshing floor was not a romantic subplot. It was a calculated, high-risk legal declaration made in complete darkness and total vulnerability. In ancient Israelite culture, the threshing floor was where grain was separated, wealth was measured, and significant transactions were sealed. By lying at the feet of Boaz and asking him to spread his garment over her, the Hebrew idiom for requesting the protection of the kinsman-redeemer covenant, Ruth was initiating a legal process with permanent economic consequences. She could have been rejected. She could have been publicly humiliated. There was a closer kinsman with a prior legal claim. The outcome was genuinely uncertain. She went anyway. This is what strategic boldness looks like. Not recklessness, not impulsivity, but a calculated move executed at exactly the right moment, in precisely the right manner, with full knowledge of the downside risk. Charlie Munger, one of the most disciplined financial thinkers of the modern era, taught a principle he called inversion. His instruction was direct. Rather than asking how to succeed, first ask what guarantees failure, and then methodically avoid every one of those paths. Invert. Always invert. When you map out every way that Ruth could have lost this moment, you understand exactly why she won it. She did not move in panic. She did not move prematurely. She followed Naomi's counsel precisely, waited for the right moment after Boaz had eaten and his heart was content, approached quietly, and made her request in the language of covenant rather than the language of desperation. She inverted every failure pattern simultaneously. Boaz responded with honor. He acknowledged her request. He was transparent about the closer kinsman. He made her a promise. Wait through the night, and the matter will be settled by morning according to the law. Then he sent her home in the pre-dawn darkness with 6 measures of barley, an unmistakable signal to Naomi that this transaction was already in motion. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Galatia, in chapter 6, verse 9, captured the spirit of this exact moment. Let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we will reap, if we do not give up. That instruction did not originate in the New Testament context alone. Ruth lived it as raw biography before Paul ever wrote it. The harvest of faithfulness always arrives, but always after a night season of unresolved waiting. Now Boaz moved to the city gate. In the ancient world, the gate was the courthouse, the trading floor, and the public record office all in one space. What would happen there would either restore Ruth's inheritance or permanently close the door. The tension was absolute. The closer kinsman was willing to redeem the land at first, until Boaz clarified the full terms. To acquire the land of Elimelech, the Redeemer was also required to take Ruth the Moabite as his wife, raising up an heir in the name of the dead to preserve the family line. The man calculated his personal risk and withdrew. He removed his sandal, the ancient legal gesture of transferring rights, and handed it to Boaz before witnesses at the gate. In that single public moment, Ruth went from gleaner to legal inheritor. The sandal was not a ceremony. It was a deed transfer. This is the equity shift that almost no one in poverty ever sees coming, because it never looks like what they imagined. Ruth did not fight for it. She did not network her way into it. She did not negotiate a better deal. She was faithful at the level she was given, and the legal structure that God had embedded into the covenant community moved on her behalf when she least expected it. The parable of the Sower, in Mark chapter 4, as Jesus Christ taught it, reveals the same architectural principle. The farmer does not manufacture the harvest. He prepares the ground, plants the seed with precision, and then the soil does what soil was designed by the Creator to do. It multiplies the input exponentially. Some seed fell on hard ground and produced nothing. Some fell in shallow soil and burned out quickly. But the seed that fell on good ground, fertile, prepared, uncompromised ground, produced 30 times, 60 times, 100 times the original investment. The critical variable was never the seed. It was always the condition of the soil receiving it. Ruth's entire life, from Moab to Bethlehem to the threshing floor to the city gate, was the preparation of good soil. Every act of loyalty, every early morning in the field, every humble bowl of barley accepted at Boaz's table. These were not individual virtues operating in isolation, they were compounding. Each decision was adding depth to the soil that would eventually receive the seed of Boaz's covenant act. And the harvest came with breathtaking speed. Ruth, chapter 4, verse 13, states that the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse. Jesse became the father of David. And from David's line, centuries of covenant promise would flow, including the throne of Solomon, the wealthiest and wisest king the ancient world had ever seen. The neighborhood women said to Naomi in Ruth, chapter 4, verse 15, "Your daughter-in-law, who loves you, has been better to you than 7 sons." 7 sons represented the highest possible statement of blessing in that culture. And that is what one faithful foreign widow, starting with nothing in a foreign land, had become. The Apostle Paul wrote these words to the church at Corinth, recorded in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6. "Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully." That is a financial principle before it is a spiritual exhortation. Paul is not inviting a feeling. He is describing a mechanism, a universal law of return that does not suspend itself for the unbeliever, the skeptic, or the comfortable. Ruth sowed bountifully in a season when she had almost nothing to sow with. She sowed loyalty to Naomi when loyalty cost her everything else. She sowed humility in the fields when her bloodline entitled her to pride. She sowed courage on the threshing floor when silence would have been safer. She sowed patience through the night when anxiety could have destroyed the outcome. And here is the revelation that this entire story has been building toward, the one hidden in plain sight inside Matthew chapter 1, verse 5 and verse 6. When the genealogy of Jesus Christ is recorded in Matthew's Gospel, 5 women are mentioned by name in what was conventionally a patrilineal record. Ruth is one of them, a Moabite widow who arrived in Bethlehem with nothing but her word, and her willingness became part of the royal and messianic bloodline itself. Every king who descended from David, including Solomon, and all the wisdom and wealth that name carries through all of history, carries Ruth's legacy forward. The ultimate return on investment in the kingdom of God is not measured in currency. It is measured in legacy. David wrote psalms that are still recited daily across the entire globe, thousands of years after his death. Solomon built structures and authored wisdom literature that still shapes financial philosophy today. And neither of them would exist without a foreign widow who decided, at the absolute lowest point of her life, to remain loyal to a covenant she was not even legally obligated to honor. If you have ever wondered whether your faithfulness in small places is being tracked by anyone who matters, the book of Ruth is God's permanent answer to that question. It is. It always has been. And the compound interest on righteousness does not expire when the season changes, or when the numbers look wrong, or when the door that was supposed to open remains shut for another night. Ruth did not know she was building a dynasty. She was just trying to put food on the table for an old woman she loved. The most significant legacies in history have all been built exactly like that. One early morning, one humble field, one faithful choice at a time, until suddenly the whole earth knows your name. If this teaching has added value to your life, subscribe to this channel, because what you just received is only the beginning of what God has hidden in these ancient pages for those with eyes to see. Keep building, keep gleaning, keep sowing. The harvest does not consult your timeline before it arrives. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward your faithfulness fully, just as he did for Ruth of Moab, the foreign widow who became the mother of kings.